Ladies and gentlemen, I am very excited to tell you about a podcast coming up with Stefanie Faye. She hosts her own show. She has an incredible body of work out there. You can go to stefaniefay.com where you can download her free audiobooks and her PDFs on neuroscience and how to build better humans. Her work is truly incredible. Her podcast is called Mindset Neuroscience. She's got 3 seasons on it. And we cover a bunch of topics surrounding policing, police training, how the brain works, how we can improve ourselves as a species. I look forward to hearing your thoughts on it, and please send me your questions, your responses. If you like it, share the podcast. Please subscribe, and you can always reach out to me at policinginamerica.com, and you can reach out to us and think about being a guest on our show or give us ideas. Thank you so much. And without further ado, here's the podcast. Stefanie Faye, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Welcome.
You're welcome. Thank you. It's my pleasure and honor to be here.
Thank you for saying that. So I came across you. I have a friend, a classmate from my USC days, and she was helping me create some training for policing. And she would mention all these great ideas and these phrases. And I said, where are you getting this? And she referred me. She said, you got to check out this podcast. And so she sends me this link, and I didn't stop. I think I did 3 back to back. So I did the first one she sent. I went all the way back to season 1 and started listening to you. So you're doing some incredible work with the neuroscience and self-regulation. What would you say is your foundation of work right now, or what are you focusing on?
Ooh, that's a good one. I would say that systems thinking is very, very important to me. So really, really trying to understand all of the interconnected layers that play into different behaviors we see, reactions. And then with that, to me comes attachment theory, our first experiences in childhood, and what you call affiliative neuroscience. So the aspect of us that's very social. So I like to say that, we've got a sympathetic nervous system, a parasympathetic, but we also have a social nervous system in a sense. So really, really looking at the impact of who surrounds us, who surrounded us, who surrounds us now, and how all of that plays into a lot of the algorithms that get created in our brains. So yeah, systems thinking, and then the attachment and affiliative kind of neuroscience. That's a big part of my work.
So thank you for that. So what I was noticing, and I'm molding this into policing, because what I'm attempting to do through the podcast and through my own training is sort of create not just a better police officer. I think that's too vague and cheesy. I'm trying to create a better human, because if I could create a better human, you're going to be better with your regulation at home. You're going to take better care of yourself. You're going to take care of your partners and then the community that you've sworn to serve. Your TED Talk talked about this, and I'll paraphrase what you said, but young people don't have the ability to self-regulate. They haven't learned that yet. So they look to people around them and they learn how to do this. And I think it was the unfortunate conclusion. You said we are surrounded by people that were not taught how to self-regulate. And now I thought to myself, okay, so I pull from the human race for my police officers, and I have these young men and women who maybe haven't been taught to self-regulate, and that we are thrusting them into these volatile situations with other humans that haven't been taught to self-regulate. And what we get are these violent encounters. I know you've done a little bit with military work. Has this at all crossed your path with policing and the mental health crisis that's happening?
Well, I mean, I used to work for the Department of Defense, so that was many years ago. It was kind of before I entered this field, but I see a lot of retrospect that happened, from that as well, and more just on the research side of things with military families. But what I feel interweaves with a lot of that I love that you brought up the TEDx talk with the prefrontal cortex and our self-regulation abilities. And what I would say is the signals and frequencies that we send out. There are, audible and visible frequencies that are a reflection of our internal state, which is a reflection of our ability to self-regulate. And
Yeah.
those frequencies are real and they are received by the receptors of another person. And they can affect the nervous system of another person, which then, puts them in a certain state.
Yeah.
So it's a a lot of layers in there, but the signals and frequencies that we transmit are being received by other people. And we also have the ability to modify and get better at how we receive the signals and frequencies of other
Mm.
people. So we can't necessarily bypass that these real wavelengths, and I'll dissect it really, in a granular way just right now, but the way that my internal organs are communicating those networks, the way my heart is beating, that is going to affect things like the tension in my vocal cords, how the amplitude, how the pressure of the air leaves my throat, that translates into atoms and molecules, bumping into themselves, which creates different waves. Those waves hit other people, and that can also be my facial gestures. Those waves hit other people, and the sensory receptors they have within them, from a mammalian perspective, these are primitive primal systems, will affect their nervous system. So how
Jeez.
I regulate what goes on inside, and then some choice points that can happen as well between that internal fluctuation and when the signals get translated out. There's a choice point there, which we have to work on, because generally speaking, it's going to be pretty reflexive. And then also how I receive someone else's.
Yeah.
I will receive it, but there is a chance for me to process it slightly differently. There's still a processing that happens before I make my next move.
So I have only 1,000 more questions for you with this. All right. So please don't let me forget about your take on stimulus and response, because there's the whole body of work with Viktor Frankl's idea of like stimulus space, what you do with the space. And I'm so curious to see how you want us to change our way of thinking. But seeing how these micro actions, twinges in our facial and the amplitude and the frequency with our voices coming out, I want to ask you a question. Police officers are told to have command presence. This is a colloquial phrase that's all over policing. And what that tends to mean is raise your voice, show people you're in charge. And I've never liked this idea. It just seems like we're yelling at people, and then it becomes almost paternal out there. Are we entering a space, based on your research and education, that we need to start rethinking what command presence means?
Yes. I mean, first of all, I would say that it's always an inside out perspective. So you don't just give people the movement that they need to make. It's what is the internal state is so important. That can't be faked. That is what transmits the signals. So it's a command internal presence first, right? And that means I command my nervous system, which means that if someone is making me nervous, I am able to modify my own internal response first and then push that outwards, right? So there's that. I would say that if that command presence is yelling, there is a little bit of an indicator that the person is not totally in control. Because yelling is a form, because of the amplitude and the pitch and the frequencies, that is going to generally trigger a sympathetic nervous response in another person, because that's an alert response. So the middle ear muscles we have, they attenuate, they modulate the frequencies that get received. When there's really high amplitude and not a lot of what you call prosody, which is an ability to convey emotion, and we can only really do that when we're in a state of somewhat safety and command of our own nervous system. When we're out of control, it will be abrupt bursts of air that are more like yelling.
Wow.
that is a mammalian, like just like a dog barking, that is a mammalian indication that this is a threatening situation. And that actually affects the middle ear muscles, which then they expand out, and the person is now in vigilance of predator. And that puts them into sympathetic nervous system, which puts blood flow to their skeletal muscles, increases their heart rate, gets them ready to mobilize, which can look like attack or running away. Mm-hmm. So a yell definitely has a purpose. If you see someone running into the street about to be hit by a car, you absolutely want them to get vigilant immediately. Mm. You're not going to use a prosodic kind of voice to convey information. You don't want it to be verbal. Like verbal information is too slow to process. Mm. In that kind of emergency situation, you do want them to immediately perk up, get very alert, and look and scan, because that's our first instinct as well. It's quick. As soon as that vigilance gets, the threat gets, sparked, it's a quick scan first. That never really gets eliminated from us, and then it can be a micro movement after that. So there's a purpose for abrupt, like loud kind of command barking, but it will put someone into vigilance and more sympathetic state. If you want to give them verbal instructions, they cannot be in a sympathetic activated state. Blood flow is no longer, and electric activity is no longer being resourced in a sense to the brain for that slower, more expensive processing of verbal commands, because there's steps to commands, right? There's instructions. The verbal realms are much more, they're slower for us to process, they're more expensive. The brain doesn't generally give resources to that unless we have enough time for that. So if we want to give any kind of instruction to a person, we don't want them to be in a sympathetic nervous system state. We don't want them to be vigilant. So command, to me, and then one other thing just to think about, visible signals and symbols also trigger a sense of hierarchy. So if you're already wearing a symbol that in a certain context, so a baby isn't going to recognize what a police officer uniform looks like. Doesn't change. Sure. But most people at a certain age are going to recognize what certain symbols are. A gun is a symbol as well. It's a symbol of, I may have more power than you in this situation. A badge, a uniform, all of these are symbols that already visibly are going to trigger different neurochemicals based on the status game that is now being played. So we don't always have to add certain layers on top of that, because it already exists, and there's already going to be some of those automatic reflexes and internal fluctuations of nervous system that are going to occur, right? So so I would say that a lot more of that, a lot more training going into thinking about what is our nervous system, how do we modulate it according to what we would like, and also what we would like the other person's nervous system state to be. Yeah. Do I want them in sympathetic fight or flight, or do I actually want them to be still? If we want someone to be still, we need them to go into parasympathetic. So that's a totally different realm than barking. And
so I've been testing the waters with this theory, and I try to, it's not getting a lot of traction with the officers. So they will often say, so what is the problem? You're holding your gun out. There's a man with a knife having an episode in the street. What are your issues? And it's usually the knife, officer safety, public safety, something along those lines. And I'll say, okay, so who doesn't want to stab you? Somebody who trusts you. So instead of giving them orders, use your cognitive resources, which are limited right now because everything's happening quick. So take whatever limited brain power you have and get them to trust you, because people that trust other people don't stab them. Now, I understand there's the intervention of narcotics or maybe some kind of a mental illness that maybe happen, but by far and large, even people in those states that I can bring down into a parasympathetic, what would you say, mode, maybe, or then at the very least, I'm not going to feel as threatened because they don't feel as threatened. But it's a completely different way of looking at things. So what I get back is typically, oh, so you're worried about, the suspect's safety. yes, because if you feel safe, well, then, I mean, I should say if they feel safe, you by proxy will then also feel safe. Is this a logical train of thought with how I'm looking at
Yes,
that, or am I
yeah,
missing something?
definitely. That would be what you could call, in a sense, like a co-regulating type of thing where
Mm-hmm.
I intentionally use the vocalizations, the frequency of my voice and my facial expressions, which again is inside out. I can't fake this. It has to be from an internal state first. You
Uh-huh.
really forget about it. Forget what we're even saying the facial gestures and voice are. If your nervous system is activated, it doesn't, that's going to be what comes out. That's what the person will read. Humans are very, very good at detecting fake versus real,
Yeah.
internal fluctuations. A couple of things come up for me. One is, so I'm going to return to coping, perceived ability to cope in a second. But the second is, sometimes when we use words like trust, it's too abstract. It's too much of a layer out
Mm-hmm.
for a lot of people, and it has different flavors to it that can trigger people because, if a person is, so if you are, a person who is responding to a situation, you are going to feel, in a sense, in danger and threatened. There's really no way around that. So it might be too much of a leap to be thinking about, I want that person to trust me in that
Mm-hmm.
moment. So a layer in between that can be flexible response or more live moment adaptation, because we don't necessarily want to trust that person if they are going to do harm. Like maybe in that moment they're fine, and then in the next they're going to flip. So what we really want is live data adaptation at all times. So we don't want to go into the zone of I'm definitely going to trust or I'm definitely going to not trust. That's already too predetermined in a sense. We actually
Yeah.
want to go to raw, like the rawest form of data we can possibly work with. And then the ability in our brain to entertain the possibility of multiple possibilities, to have
Mm-hmm.
lots of different choices and strategies in a moment, so that we're not immediately going to an automatic response that we've always done. It's very in the moment, microsecond level adaptive. That's what we're
Mm-hmm.
looking for. And I think most humans in the world, we have too many preset algorithms because we just don't
Uh-huh.
know about this. We're not trained in this. School doesn't help us with it. Most of our life does not help us with this. And like
Right.
going back to my TEDx talk, we don't have previous generations that knew how to do any of this either. So they're in their pre-programmed response constantly. And that's what we were generally or have observed our entire lives. So it's more about we're getting out of pre-programmed, prepared kind of responses, and we want to go into raw, live adaptation.
How do you teach an officer, like they have to okay, I mean, how do I word the question? So it seems like if we allow them to do that, it's going to feel like they're winging it. It's just
Mm,
you're making things up on the fly, and there's so many policies and rules and procedures that they have to follow. If it works well, great, but if
yeah,
it doesn't work well, there's this punitive cloud looming
yeah,
over them, like, well, you should have just tasted them, this was the
yeah.
case, or you should have done this. How
Mm,
do we need to rethink how we think as humans in general?
mm. These are really good questions. Like, yeah, because these are such complex issues, especially when you're talking about people who work in a field where the mistakes, when there is a mistake, it's really serious, right?
Yes.
Um, so I would say that when it comes to prepared responses, I think it's okay to have a certain number of frameworks and guidelines
Hmm.
that train people in terms of like these are the different choices we have. Um, I would say there's that aspect, and then in terms of um, like rethinking, I do think that there is not enough ability to perceive our own internal state
Yeah.
and make a quick choice about what to do about that. That's what I feel is missing. Yeah, I would say that to me would be maybe the biggest skill we could start to really work on. And this would be with every single area of life. And that's a really big point I want to make about this, is that if we only use some of these ideas, like let's say, for example, I perceive the better I get at perceiving my internal state, becoming aware of it, the moment I'm aware of it, I've moved it into a new area of the brain that you could call the conscious workspace. Only from the conscious workspace do I now have choice points. Otherwise, it does a different loop. It's that slow, you've talked about the slow and the fast thinking, right?
Yes.
If I'm not aware of my internal state, it just does the fast loop.
Right.
I want it to travel just a little bit more. And we're not talking seconds even, we're talking less than that, microseconds, to have some more choice points. So that internal awareness is really important. The thing is with the brain, you call it survival of the busiest, it's the practice. So that means that when you're in a grocery store, when you're with your spouse, when you're with your kids, when you're with whoever, these are all the moments that we have to start to become more aware of these internal states, to actually activate that circuitry so that it's so strong and so readily accessible that it's accessible just in way more situations. So not only, and I know that for your audience, it may not be a realistic kind of endeavor, but I just want to plant those seeds, which is that every moment of our lives is this moment to practice. How do I perceive what's happening inside me? How do I just pause for a microsecond and then make that choice before my next move?
Okay, all right. Perfect. Thank you for that. Now, a question to you is, and I get asked this often because I try to do some Daniel Kahneman stuff and just tell officers, you want to be in system 2, you want this prefrontal cortex, that system 1 amygdala, emotional hijacking. We keep it nice and simple. But the question I get asked, and I'm not exactly sure how to answer, is if I'm in a system 1, then how do I use system 2 to get out of system 1 when system 1 is kind of driving the car off the cliff? Is it possible for those systems to light up simultaneously? Because in order for me to get out of it, I need that executive function to fire.
Yeah.
So if it is possible, which I'm guessing it is, can you maybe give us some tips and tricks on how we can do this, or ways we can practice this?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that it's we generally are not going to bypass the initial flare up of a stress response like that's coming in through the different stimulus. But like what you're saying, what we do have the capacity to do is have that flash of whatever it is, and then be able to use these other areas of our brain, especially that prefrontal executive functioning, to then modulate what the next response is, and even flash, get new circuits to activate that alter what happens inside our body. So, an example would be and again, I think that has to be practiced as often as possible and in as many different kinds of situations as possible. Because what people often don't realize is there's so many moments where they're actually really getting triggered by something and they don't realize it. And generally speaking, it's social interactions of some sort. And what I would say also is that all of that can get layered into very stressful situations because we have so little awareness of what is feeding into our distress response. So as many moments that we can, and I do like to recommend that there is time set aside every single day, and which is, you could call attentional training. It's attentional training, 10 to 15 minutes a day, where you are very actively and deliberately and intentionally tuning out outside stimulus, slowing down brain waves, and getting into a more of an interoceptive noticing type of mode. It's the noticing mode, or the witness mode. And it is different brain waves. And, a lot of my work has to do with brain waves. But I think the more we can train a specific kind of rhythm in our brain, the easier access all the cells of those networks have to create that rhythm. And that rhythm is generally in the alpha range. And that comes from, if we can train it 10 to 15 minutes a day, minimum, we train it. And the way we train it is we have to actually, and it sounds counterintuitive because you think, oh, I should be training with stimulus all the time. Yes, but the thing is that the first step is we're trying to actually train our interoceptive awareness. That awareness of our internal state, to me, is the key. It is the key to regulation, to choice, to having mastery over every move that we make in stress responses and in joyful, excitatory stuff too, right? So the more, if we can make this if that can be a practice that happens every day, an intentional training practice where people get into some almost like an alpha rhythm. Well, it is an alpha rhythm. And that is generally with eyes closed because we need to remove outside stimulus in order for the brainwaves to get a little bit more in a more rhythmic pattern. And paying attention to something like our breath, which I know sounds cliche and, people talk about all of this stuff, but there is something really powerful to it. And I watch it happen. I look at brain graphs all the time. I look at maps. I know what this stuff does and how important it is. So yeah, any kind of training, intentional training where we get into some of that interoceptive, noticing, witness kind of rhythm and brainwave activation. And that then can translate into live moment awareness of our internal state, which then does, I don't know if I'd say, maybe it's simultaneous, but where you can have a stress response. And because that system is so well activated, you can now notice, like you have the quick flash of whatever it is, but you have a quick moment of noticing that you're in that. That now is just like burst the prefrontal cortex online. So you have just a couple of choices, which is it that or is it that? Okay, it's that. Let's do this. Right.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
So I'm going to explain it back to you, and then hopefully, and of course, I'll always cite you on this, but the idea that if you spend time in this introspective moments, what you're doing is you're allowing yourself to access this place so that it becomes familiar, maybe.
Yeah.
And when you are in these high stress moments, you have a better opportunity to at least, as these brainwaves are moving, to cross this path of this familiar place, which then could say, hey, hold right here. This is a good place to be because you've been here before and you know what this is. Is that fair as like an analogy?
Yeah. And let me just add just a touch to that as well, which is that in terms of this brainwave activity, so when we go into a very, very fast frequency, it's generally what you call the high betas. The cluster of activity that's happening in the brain is very pinpointed. It's neurons that are very, very, very close to each other. This means that our range of focus is extremely narrow. And there's a couple of issues with that. One is when our range of focus is too narrow and too pinpointed, we may be focused on one particular thing of that person in front of us and ignoring lots of other information that's very, very, very important for us to notice.
Sure.
The other second point of that is that when we are constantly like using our mind in that way, it means that that high beta frequency is so familiar, you could say, used, it's so worn that it's called, a preparatory response or anticipatory, where we're already geared to look for very specific things before the situation has even happened. So it's this predictive algorithm that it's going to look for whatever that thing is. And it generally looks for threat first, always. That's just the way the statistics of the brain body system work. So that means that we're just generally going, the attention, the range is just way too pinpointed in most situations that we're ignoring a lot of other important data that's there. So we want to get to a slightly more open awareness. And when we're in threat response, attention narrows, we want to get just a little bit more open in that. And that is where that alpha brainwave, it's a little bit more open. When we train that intentionally every day, just like what you're saying, it allows for, because it has to do with more neurons that are across multiple networks and hemispheres. It's more open like this.
Mm-hmm.
Training in that then allows faster access to that in situations where our awareness is now more open, and we really want that. We want open awareness so that we're gathering data. Yeah.
Open awareness allows us to solve the problem.
Yes.
And this is what I'm trying to convince people, like, stop. I think we're limiting, language matters. And I think I'm getting this from you too, how we say things and the words we use. If we just call ourselves law enforcement officer, tacitly, when we step out of the car and engage with somebody, we're here to enforce laws. And I'm trying to say, get rid of that old vestige of that. You are a problem solver. And there's a number of problems here. Now, you may have to triage these. You may have to get some kind of a hierarchy, but solve the problems. Because if I only limit them to do as I say, and they don't, my options become more and more narrow. Opposed to, well, why aren't they listening? What could I do to get you to listen? And it sounds like you said, it sounds very altruistic and cheesy, but it's how we get better, and it's how we establish trust.
Yes.
I want people around us to see us that we're really trying to make the best of this. So if a tragic encounter is the result of this, people say, man, they really, really gave this a heck of an effort.
Yeah, I love that. It's such a powerful point. And I would say this translates to all social interactions of every human being on the planet, is that if we go into a mode of, I'm going to be more openly aware and gathering data, I'm here to gather data about what is happening right now. That is a very, first of all, just the brain activity that's happening, which then translates into tiny micro gestures of my face. Everything changes. If I am gathering data in this moment, is very different than when I've already decided what I'm going to do.
Yeah.
So that alone would already just open up the other person as well, because of the micro frequencies that I'm sending out, because I'm gathering data. They're first of all going to be more willing to offer data, but I'm also just going to pick up on more. That's very important for solving the problem in that sense. And that to me would improve a lot of human relations, because if you feel like you're in the presence of somebody who's actually honestly trying to gather data, that is what we call understanding. They are seeking to understand. They're seeking to understand me in this moment. And that would be healing for a lot of people, because I think many of us don't feel understood. We don't feel like people are trying to understand us. They're putting their labels immediately on us, or their perceptions. So to me, it just brings out this a totally different vibration, in a sense, of this is what we're trying to do. We're really honestly trying to understand. And of course, there's situations. I was going to say, there's situations where you don't have time for that.
Right.
But the thing is that there are many. And if we don't train to open our awareness and train for the data gathering and the attentional data gathering, like stimulus gathering, we don't train for that, then we've completely eliminated that possibility of our attentional mechanisms to be used in that way.
Yeah.
And so we've just eliminated that. Yeah.
It's interesting you say that. And I'm thinking the ancients have thought this forever. Seek first to understand.
Yes.
The Stoics and the ancients, they've known this wisdom.
Yeah.
I'm pulling up some of your stuff because I just have so many notes in front of me with all your stuff. You have a lot of stuff out there. I don't know if you know this. If you've ever stopped to look, it's a lot to go through. But I found this really interesting. And before I forget, the stimulus space response. And it's usually we have to think about this differently, the stimulus response model. All right. And it's an outdated way of thinking about humans that is not always helpful. The outdated way of thinking, this is Stefanie Faye for the listeners, the outdated way of thinking, a paradigm, is a stimulus response model. So please share with us your thoughts on this and how we need to start looking at this.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this comes from the stimulus response model comes from behaviorism, which was, a while back. And they were using, pigeons and rats for a lot of studies. And so what they
Huh.
saw was that, if you give us a simple kind of reward or a punishment, like a shock, that there was a very predictable behavior that would happen. The issue is that, first of all, the more complex of an organism you get, the more choices, in a sense, that organism has. And so the
Sure.
stimulus response model is completely irrelevant for humans, other than potentially very, very, very extreme things. For example, potentially the startle response.
Mhm.
I can get into that in a second. Generally speaking, there is the the stimulus organism response is the more updated, evolved model. And that basically just acknowledges that you have a stimulus, but within an organism, there are many different factors that modulate and mediate what their response is going to be. So their internal physiological state, um, their perceived ability to cope with
Mhm.
a stimulus is very important. And that all of this can get built up. It gets built up through the different algorithms that come from childhood, from culture, from all those kinds of things. Even how much they've slept, what they've eaten, their
That's right.
blood sugar levels, their level of distress. And another really big one that a lot of people don't understand the importance of is sound vibration. So low level bass frequencies that have a certain hertz to them, those very specific frequencies tend to have conduction on our bone. And anything that goes into that zone actually activates our vigilance response. And so it makes it very, very difficult to pay attention when there is the bass frequency
Hmm.
vibrations of sound acoustics that are going on. That can be from like air conditioners,
Wow.
traffic, anything that has a lot of mechanical movement creates these lower bass vibrations. Those lower frequencies activate the middle ear muscles, which open them up and make it very, very difficult for a person to tense them enough to focus on human voice. So if
Wow.
there's a lot of bass frequencies, and that can come from explosions as well, but even just traffic, just lots and lots and lots of noise, if that's there, the ability of a human to actually, you have to tense, there's a very specific mechanism inside us in the middle ear muscles. Those muscles have to tense in a very specific way to tighten the skin on the eardrum that
Hmm.
allows for the person to tune into the very specific frequency band of human voice, which has its own little band, just like kind of antenna frequencies or whatever. So, in order to focus on that, which also there's a mechanical relationship between that and the eye movement, so they're very correlated. So, if that tenses, then the eyes can actually look at the person, and they're interconnected. Then the person can hear another person's voice. But
Mhm.
there's a few things to think about with that. One is that if people have a lot of stress in their lives and have been exposed to a lot of that, they may lack some of that neural tone that's needed to actually tighten the middle ear muscles.
Hmm.
So you will, if you're trying to talk to them, it doesn't even look like they can hear you. And if you add any kind of sounds to the environment, and that can be from a lot of just background sounds, very, very difficult. It takes a person with a lot of that toning in order to actually be able to do it.
Hmm.
So that's just another factor to just think about with the stimulus organism response. No, it doesn't work like that because you can do this, but if that organism if there's vibrations going around or they don't have a lot of that neural tone, they will not, like neurologically, physiologically, they will not be able to pinch, tighten the middle ear muscles to actually get their eyes to look and literally hear and listen to your very specific frequency band of human voice.
So, Stephanie, it's not ideal to have a low-flying aircraft above in an orbit while we shout commands at somebody. That might not
No.
be the most ideal. See, this is so fascinating. I don't think anyone's looked past the idea that this is there, and it's almost like a show of force. Like here we are. Look at how important we take this instance. And there have been multiple times when even the officers can't think because a
Yeah.
helicopter is 500 feet above them in low orbit.
Yeah.
And but what
Exactly.
are we doing, right? We're flooding the area with light, and in case somebody runs, or
Yes.
and
So
it's so
yes.
challenging. Please,
Yeah.
your thought.
Well, I mean, right there alone, like that puts an officer at risk as well because they also now cannot use mechanisms to tighten where they need to tighten those middle ear muscles in order to hear what they need to hear from whatever is going on around them. It's putting them and that opening up of those middle ear muscles tends to put people into a sympathetic response because it's detection of predator. So it's also, it is not, yeah, it's not. And the thing is, we have to be realistic also, though, with what we get, right? So this is
Yeah.
where some of this training just has to incorporate some of this because it's just, there is going to be noise. There is going to be all of this. And that is where some of this intentional training can be really important, which is where if someone can start to recognize that, oh, wow, when there's a certain sound that's going on, I'm having a harder time focusing.
Hmm.
First of all, just noticing that is already lighting up new circuits of the brain because you're already
Yeah.
getting into a space where you're like, oh, okay, wait a minute, my decision might be coming from a different stress response than is needed, right? So
Yes.
yeah, we still have to be realistic that these loud vibrations are going to be in a lot of these situations that we can't get out of that. But the noticing of our internal state is still where some of that power lies, I would say. Yeah.
Okay. All right. If I don't let me, I'm writing it down. Failure. I want to talk to you about failure because in one of
Yeah.
your podcasts you discussed this, and I shared it with my 8-year-old nephew because he's so worried about doing anything because of failure. And I
Mm.
said, "You want to listen to this podcast by this very smart lady?" And he really enjoyed it. But I have to get some of these questions out. So,
Yes.
why is this is from Christy? Why is mindset neuroscience so important for us as humans to understand and to better
Mm.
our lives?
Well, I mean, I would say a lot of it is kind of what I'm already starting to talk about, which is using the power of our mind to alter how we interpret what's happening. That
Great.
gives us new choices.
Yes.
I'd say that would be kind of the main thing that I would say.
So
And
then,
yeah,
oh
go
no,
ahead.
please. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So now I have to challenge my own assumptions. I will often say we are a cognitive passenger on this vessel that is the body, but the brain is really running the show in many ways. And we are sort of catching up to what the brain is doing. And I use sort of low level examples like, okay, just tell yourself you're not going to use the restroom today. Just go ahead and just make a choice. Like the brain will say, you are going to use the restroom at a certain point. So how do I square this idea
Mm,
that this idea of consciousness? Like I always felt that my brain is in much more control of things than I am. And then we get into this free
mm,
will idea and all that. But I'm kind of curious now to
mm.
hear what you think of that.
Important. That's really important. That's a good kind of counterpoint as well, which is that the body is a very important player in this. They are not separated things. So the body itself, every single cell of the body is already making calculations before
Mm-hmm.
information even hits our brain. So, so how, first of all, how I would say is the witnessing and the noticing still becomes the most important because we may not alter how the sensory receptors of our body are already, they're gatekeepers. Antonio Damasio talks about this. The sense is like the cells in our retina are already computing stuff before it even sends data to our brain,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Or those middle ear muscles we can't control that. If there's a certain frequency, they will expand or they will tighten. We're not control. So that already is altering the data that comes up to our brain. And every tiny cell of our body is already experience dependent and threshold based, right? So
Mm-hmm.
that part is flooding into us. And our body is already making some kind of decision about what enters our brain in a sense. So our brain's not totally in control of that. that is all going to happen.
Yeah.
Where we can have more control is once the sensory information has come in and has created some of these fluctuations that are generally completely unconscious, uncontrollable to us, where it makes our heart flutter, it makes whatever happens. It's after that initial kind of burst in a sense of activity. That's where we have a moment. Once it's come up to the brain, there is a level of processing that then happens. So that's where we get the command. That's where we get some of this power, is in the noticing and that observing. And then, yeah.
Okay. All right. That's fair.
Yeah.
Very fair. All right. Stand by. There's more coming your way. You mentioned the dangers, and I've mentioned this as well, and I'm kind of curious what you think of this as far as the mindset of us versus them. And we tend to break things up in this very binary environment in policing. You're either guilty or innocent. You're complying or you're not complying. We don't. You're running or you're not. So how do we get away from this us versus them? And what are the dangers of this when it comes to policing a civil society?
Wow, that's a big question.
Take your time. Take your time.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say that first, what comes to mind is, there's lack of complexity. And what I mean by complexity is multiple possibilities within every single moment.
Yeah.
Every single situation has multiple possibilities. And as soon as we narrow those down, we're losing complexity. When we lose complexity, we lose the number of degrees of freedom of what we have to choose from for our behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
Now, for the most part, we're pretty energy conserving systems. So we like to only have two choices. It's just so much easier for all of us. So our brain will always gear us. Our brain's always trying to conserve energy, always. That's what we have to understand. We're fighting entropy. We're fighting the second law of thermodynamics, which is dissipation. So our brain body system is always going to do whatever it can to conserve as much energy as possible. Always. So it will always want things predictable. It will want to have the fewest choices possible, right? It will also always want to be safe in that sense too, because anything that's threatening uses extra resources and energy, which just depletes the system. So familiarity is safe. Novelty is always threatening. Unfamiliar is always placed in the statistical category of threat by our system. It has to. Otherwise, we wouldn't have survived as a species. So novelty and unfamiliarity is always, as an algorithm, because this is all like computation, statistics, and stuff. That's how our brains work. Always placed in the threat category. It's always perceived as that first, and only with more information can it get put down into a different category. So novelty, unfamiliarity. So the brain body system will avoid that at all times because that's energy, that's using energy. It wants familiarity, it wants predictability all the time. So based on that, if we have to just understand and then just kind of recognize that of us, that generally speaking, we will always kind of want, in a sense, or lean towards binary, like this or that.
Okay. Because
of this energy conservation mechanism. So we have to push ourselves into complexity because it does it's always going to feel like more effort. So most people are always going to resist complexity. They just naturally will. It's almost like a physiological response. Like, oh God, that's exhausting. Like the brain's like, no, that's exhausting. No. One or the other. That's it. I don't want to use that more energy. So it's always going to be effort to try and get people to be more complex, to push towards complexity.
Yeah.
But here's where we can do what?
To get complex. It's complicated to get complexity, but we want that because we have more options and opportunity to solve.
And this is the tricky part. And this is where is that there is a benefit to complexity, but it's long term. And it's kind of hard for people, especially, I've been talking about like that prefrontal cortex. We're not born with a very sophisticated, accessible prefrontal cortex. We have to have experiences that build up this prefrontal cortex, which is the mechanism we have for future projection, long-term decision making, really going far out into the future. What we have to understand, and this is where we can play with, in terms of when we're educating or training people, in moments where we have their attention, and this is where being very engaging with our learning, like making learning environments very emotionally juicy and enticing and exciting and appealing. Like we really, really need that. We need those juices flowing in learning environments. So it's not sitting in a chair, generally speaking, listening to someone talk. Like there has to be a little bit more just juices flowing. Yeah. So this is where learning theory needs to come into training as well, right? But if we can get people in a learning environment to feel an emotional connection and to feel some of that, what the reward could look like, if they started to use a bit more of those resources for that complex thinking, how much it would benefit their life in many different areas. So if we're engaging in complexity, if we're saying it's not just this or this, let's add a couple more, let's just add even one more category, or two, let's add two, whatever. If we can make that idea, just the concept of complexity and complex thinking, more enticing for people, they're more likely to kind of feel like it's appealing to do, because remember, we're fighting against the system that's always going to say, no, less complexity, please, less. So that's where whenever I've done training, I'd really like to also appeal to people's personal lives, their romantic lives, how they are with their children, like all these different ways that complexity and complex thinking, interoceptive, this mature prefrontal cortex, the delicious rewards that can actually come from this in many different areas of our life. I like to add that to some of the learning. And then even if you don't even want to go there, because that's just too much, thinking about how that can appeal to somebody in terms of their career advancement, to their status, their social hierarchy, right? Because you will become the more you master a lot of this and this complexity, you're going into long-term projection. So there's different rewards that I think we can appeal to with people when it comes to this idea of being more complex thinking. And we have to figure out how to do that, because we will not resort to that. It's
great. It's so good. I just feverishly writing things down, but I have to get to a few more of the questions.
Yes.
But I want to pause here, because you talked about it. It's a nice segue. New experiences, Stefanie Faye, new experiences light up new circuits in your brain. Challenge yourself and know that mistakes and awkwardness are signs of newly expanding, flexing neural networks. I'm trying to be in a very street level language. Failure is okay. Because on the other side of failure or challenge is a little better version of you. Yeah. But you'll never get there unless you fail. And it's so hard. Again, in my industry, failure is met with punitive measures. And we want to avoid punishment. So I'd rather do nothing. This is a phrase that's unfortunately true. A police officer has never gotten in trouble for doing too little. But we get in trouble for doing too much.
Right.
And so how now, with what you say, which I think is incredibly important, we have to embrace failure. We don't want to try new things. My little nephew does not want to try new things because he's not good at it. And I'll tell him, but this is how you get good. But he can't get over the fact that he's going to be awkward. It's going to look silly. He doesn't know how to draw, and it looks, not as good as it could. But is this something we need to teach at schools and at our youth, to start showing them the difference of failure is how you get better, and embracing failure?
Yes, very much. I mean, There's a phrase that I like from a person who does a lot of research on stroke rehabilitation, which is, and her name's Dr. Lara Boyd, which is increased struggle leads to increased structural change in the brain. And what that means is that if there is not a feeling of, failing and then kind of pushing in a new direction, that feeling of if you make a mistake, you're not good at something, and then you keep pushing towards something new or a mastery of something. If you don't have that, you're not creating new structures in your brain. If you're only doing the things that you know how to do, you are just repeating what's already built.
Yeah.
So the only way to build more, to expand and have more circuits that are accessible to fire, you have to go into that unfamiliar territory, which always feels like a level of exhaustion to a certain degree and a feeling of, and it's unfamiliar, which means that there will generally always be a feeling of it's threatening.
Oh.
That will always kind of exist when we first do something new. It will send those signals to our body. So yeah, the more we, and I think really teaching this from a young age is critical, but at any point, really getting a little bit more familiar with the idea that when something feels, especially when we're in an environment like a learning environment, if it feels like we don't like it and we're feeling really awkward or we're almost like disdainful of it, that's often there's a bit of a threat response happening because that's a defense mechanism. So knowing that sometimes that feeling of threat is happening from the unfamiliar experience of like, I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to do this. That's an aversion response, like when you don't know how to do something because it's unfamiliar, so the brain won't have the algorithms already in place to deal with it. So it will try and push you away from that. Like there's kind of this battle between newness and new mastery and new kinds of strengths and power, and then the very conservative aspects of us that will be very aversive to any of that because it wants to conserve energy. So there's kind of always a battle between those two forces in our life. So yeah, just understanding that that's happening, and that sometimes when we're feeling like, I don't want to learn that, that's kind of an aversive response, and it's mainly because something is new.
Can we take your suggestion of intentional introspection?
Interoception.
Introception. Can I give the officers, go into this space, be aware of your breathing, and experience failure, experience struggle so that they become more comfortable with it and so they become more accepting of it? Can I tell them to visualize a hectic scene with a helicopter overhead and lights flashing and people yelling so that they can see themselves, they can actually visualize themselves, create that heuristic, create that response to say, when I'm in this position, I stay calm. And we start building new neural pathways of being calm in the storm. Is that possible?
Yes, yeah, you could definitely do that. I would say there could be another layer that could happen as well to help people anchor into that, because some people have a hard time visualizing and noticing their feelings because it's just something they haven't done a lot. But in a classroom environment, because if that's where the training is happening first, there could be just some scenarios where like a bit of role playing of some sort where they even do something, it could be unrelated to a certain degree, but they really literally have no idea how to do something, and to feel what that feels like inside their body as they are feeling like maybe they're embarrassed in front of their colleagues because they don't know how to do it, or they just don't know how. So that could be another layer. But definitely also adding you can do the visualization training is one way to help activate those circuits.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And I have to be cognizant of your time. So I'm going to end with one last one.
Yeah.
If you can give our officers and listeners, and even we get activists that listen too, because I try to bring them in and say, look, help make my officers better. Don't just criticize them. Help make them better. Help us. We need to do this together. So what would be one thing you could share with the people that are battling this, trying to bridge this gap, if we could do one thing now and all the host of other things later, but right now, the first thing we need to do to start bridging this gap together is
increase our willingness to be more complex thinkers. Yeah. Increase that. Make that a priority. Make complexity a priority. And there's so much in that word complexity, but just basically all the different things that I'm saying, which is many, many different systems all coming together, which is your interoceptive noticing system, your ability to gather data in a live moment, your understanding of how your past plays a role in your current perception, how another person's past plays a role in their current perception reactions. So that complexity of how level of sleep, level of nutrition, blood sugar, that's the complexity. Like how many different systems, and that sounds exhausting for most people, but even if you can just even have a diagram that shows here is, you got stimulus, but you got organism, and then just a few diagrams of all the different systems that could be affecting how they're perceiving and reacting and behaving. Even just having a visual of that or a flash or hearing that lights up those networks just even briefly. And the more we do, the better. But even if it's just that one time, in that one moment, that gives the person a slightly better chance that the next time they have an interaction, there's just a small little activation of, oh, wait a minute. There might be more to this than just what I think. Like there might be a lot of different things happening at this moment. And that also, I'm very, very, very big on prevention. It's about prevention more than intervention, if we can get there. And that is acknowledging how many different systems are coming in so that we can expand how we prepare, how we mentally and physiologically prepare our brain-body system for every situation. That systems thinking preventative approach, I think, is that's where I would want to put a lot of priority.
Excellent. It sounds complicated, and that's a good thing. That's exactly what we want.
Yeah, that's right.
That's what we're looking for.
There is no simple solutions.
Stefanie Faye, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening. Thank you so much for being here. And I can't wait. I hope I can get you back on again, and we could talk about so much more.
Yes, I'd love it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stefanie.